George Buchanan was a Scottish historian and humanist scholar. According to historian Keith Brown, Buchanan was the most profound intellectual 16th-century Scotland produced. His ideology of resistance to royal usurpation gained widespread acceptance during the Scottish Reformation. Brown says the ease with which King James VII was deposed in 1689 shows the power of Buchananite ideas. Early life, early upbringing and education in Paris. His father, a Highlander and a younger son of an old family, owned the farm of Moss in the parish of Culloden, Stirlingshire, but he died young, leaving his widow, 5 sons, and 3 daughters in poverty. George's mother, Agnes Heriot, was of the family of the Heriots of Trabrune, East Lothian, of which George Heriot, founder of Heriot's Hospital, was also a member. Buchanan, a native speaker of Scottish Gaelic, is said to have attended Culloden School, but not much is known of his early education. His brother, Patrick Buchanan, was also a scholar. In 1520 he was sent by his uncle, James Heriot, to the University of Paris, where he first came in contact with the two great influences of the age, the Renaissance and the Reformation. There, according to him, he devoted himself to the writing of verses, partly by liking, partly by compulsion. Returned to Scotland. In 1522 his uncle died, and George Buchanan, who was at the time severely ill, was unable to stay in Paris and returned to Scotland. After recovering from his illness, he joined the French auxiliaries who had been brought over to Scotland by John Stuart, Duke of Albany, and took part in an unsuccessful siege of Wark Castle on the border with England in late 1523. In the following year he entered the University of St. Andrews, where he graduated B.A. in 1525. He had gone there mainly to attend the lectures of John Mayer on logic, and when Mayer moved to Paris, Buchanan followed him in 1526. Professor and procurator in 1528, Buchanan graduated M.A. at the Scots College in Paris. The next year he was appointed regent, or professor, in the College of St. Barbe, and taught there for over 3 years. St. Barbe was one of the most prestigious and advanced colleges at the time. George added to that prestige by creating new reforms in teaching Latin. In 1529 he was elected procurator of the German nation in the University of Paris, and was re-elected 4 times in 4 successive months. He resigned his regentship in 1531, and in 1532 became tutor to Gilbert Kennedy, 3rd Earl of Cassilis, with whom he returned to Scotland early in 1537, having acquired a great reputation for learning. Theological stance. At this period Buchanan assumed the same attitude toward the Roman Catholic Church as Erasmus. He did not repudiate its doctrines, but considered himself free to criticize its practice. Though he listened to the arguments of the Protestant reformers, he did not join the ranks until 1553. His first literary production in Scotland, when he was in Lord Cassilis's household in the West Country, was the poem Somnium, a satirical attack on the Franciscan friars and the monastic life generally. This assault on the monks was not displeasing to James V, who engaged Buchanan as tutor to one of his natural sons, Lord James Stuart, and encouraged him in a more daring effort. The poems Palinodia and Franciscanus A Fratres remained unpublished for many years, but made the author hated by the Franciscan order. Humanist in exile. Arrest, escape and relocation. In 1539 there was persecution in Scotland of the Lutherans, and Buchanan among others was arrested. Although the king had withheld his protection, Buchanan managed to escape and made his way to London, and then Paris. In Paris, however, he found himself in danger when his main enemy, Cardinal David Beaton, arrived there as ambassador, and on the invitation of André de Wouver, he moved aboard Bordeaux. Bouvet was then principal of the newly founded College of Guyenne, and by his influence Buchanan was appointed professor of Latin. During his time several of his major works, the translations of Medea and Alcestis, and the two dramas, Jephthys and Baptistes, were completed. Michel de Montaigne was Buchanan's pupil at Bordeaux and acted in his tragedies. In the Essay of Presumption he classes Buchanan with Jean d'Orit, Theodore Bezet, Michel de l'Hôpital, Pierre de Montdore and Adrianus Turnebus, as one of the foremost Latin poets of his time. Here also Buchanan formed a lasting friendship with Julius Caesar Scaliger. In later life he won the admiration of Joseph Scaliger, who wrote an epigram on Buchanan which contains the couplet, famous in its day, Imperii fierat Romani Scotia limes, Romani eloqui Scotia limes erat. Returned to Paris. In 1542 or 1543 he returned to Paris, and in 1544 he was appointed regent in the Collège du Cardinal Leman. Among his colleagues were Emeritus and Turnebus. Although little is known about George during this time, we can gather that he probably once again fell ill according to an elegy he wrote to his comrades Testaeus and Tevius. Coimbra. In 1547 Buchanan joined the band of French and Portuguese humanists who had been invited by Bouvet to lecture in the Portuguese University of Coimbra. The French mathematician Elie Vinet and the Portuguese historian Geronimo Osorio were among his colleagues. Bouvet, called by Montaigne Laplace Grand Principal de France, was rector of the university, which had reached the summit of its prosperity under the patronage of King John III, but the rectorship had been coveted by Diogo de Bouvet, uncle of André and formerly head of St. Barbe. It is probable that before André's death at the end of 1547 Diogo had urged the Inquisition to investigate him and his staff, up to 1906, when the records of the trial were first published in full. Buchanan's biographers generally attributed the attack to the influence of Cardinal Beaton, the Franciscans, or the Jesuits, and the whole history of Buchanan's residency in Portugal was extremely obscure. Trial and imprisonment. A commission of inquiry was appointed in October 1549 and reported in June 1550. Buchanan and two Portuguese, Diogo de Teve and João da Costa, were committed for trial. Teve and Costa were found guilty of various offences against public order, and the evidence shows that there was ample reason for a judicial inquiry. Buchanan was accused of Lutheran and Judaistic practices. He defended himself, admitting that some of the charges were true. About June 1551 he was sentenced to abjure his errors, and to be imprisoned in the monastery of São Bento in Lisbon. Here he listened to edifying discourses from the monks, whom he found not unkind but ignorant. In his leisure he began to translate the Psalms into Latin verse, completing the greater part of the work. Release. After 7 months, Buchanan was released on condition that he remain in Lisbon, and on the 28th of February 1552 this restriction was lifted. Buchanan then sailed for England, but soon made his way to Paris, where in 1553 he was appointed regent in the College of Bronckhorst. He remained in that post for 2 years, and then accepted the office of tutor to the son of the Maréchal de Brissac. It was almost certainly during this last stay in France, where Protestantism was being repressed under King Henry II and his son Francis II, that Buchanan took the side of Calvinism. Return to Scotland. Espousal of Protestantism. In 1560 or 1561 he returned to Scotland, and by April 1562 was installed as tutor to the young Mary, Queen of Scots, who read Livy with him daily. Hitherto, though a supporter of the new learning and a merciless exposer of the vices of the clergy, he had remained in the ancient faith, but he now openly joined the Protestant Reformed Church, and in 1563 1566 was appointed Principal of St Leonard's College, St Andrews, by the Earl of Moray. 2 years before, he had received from the Queen the gift of the revenues of Crossrogale Abbey. Though a layman, he was made Moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in 1567. He had sat in the assemblies from 1563. He was the last lay person to be elected Moderator until Alison Elliot in 2004, the first female Moderator. Tutor and other offices. Buchanan accompanied the Regent Moray to England, and his famous Detectio Mariae Reginae of scathing exposure of the Queen's relations to Darnley and the circumstances leading up to his death, published London, John Day, was produced to the commissioners at Westminster. In 1570, after the assassination of Moray, he was appointed one of the preceptors of the young king, and it was through his strict tuition that James VI acquired his scholarship. As the young king's senior tutor, Buchanan subjected James to regular beatings but also instilled in him a lifelong passion for literature and learning. Buchanan sought to turn James into a God-fearing, Protestant king who accepted the limitations of monarchy, as outlined in his treatise De Jure Regni apud Scotos. While royal tutor, he also held other offices. He was for a short time Director of Chancery, and then became Keeper of the Privy Seal of Scotland, a post which entitled him to a seat in the Parliament. He appears to have continued in this office for some years, at least till 1579. Final years. His last years were occupied with completion and publication of 2 of his major works, De Jure Regni apud Scotos and Rerum Scoticarum Historia. He died in his house on Kennedy's Close in Edinburgh on 28 September 1582 and was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard on the following day. The grave was originally marked by a through stone, but this had sunk into the ground by 1701. Currently, 2 memorials in Greyfriars each claim to mark his burial, one just northwest of the church and a second more modest memorial near the eastmost path. Works. Latin scholar for mastery of the Latin language, Buchanan has seldom been surpassed by any modern writer. His style is not rigidly modelled on that of any classical author, but has a freshness and elasticity of its own. Hugh Trevor Roper called him, by universal consent, the greatest Latin writer, whether in prose or in verse, in 16th-century Europe. He wrote Latin as if it were his mother tongue. Buchanan also had a rich vein of poetical feeling and much originality of thought. His translations of the Psalms and of the Greek plays are more than mere versions. His 2 tragedies, Baptists and Jephthys, enjoyed a European reputation for academic excellence. His Pompey verses were written for performance at the court entertainments of Mary, including the offering of the rustic gods sung during a masque devised by Bastian Pages for the baptism of King James. Prose works. In addition to these works, Buchanan wrote in prose Chameleon, a satire in Scots against Maitland of Lethington, first printed in 1711, a Latin translation of Linacre's grammar, Libellus de Prosodia and Vita ab ipso scripta biennio ante mortem, edited by Archibald. His other poems are Fratres Fraterrimi, Elegiae Silvi, 2 sets of verses entitled Hendecasyllabon Liber and Iamborn Liber, 3 books of epigrammata, a book of miscellaneous verse, De Sphera, suggested by the poem De Sphera Mindia of Joanda Sacrobisco, and intended as a defense of the Ptolemaic theory against the new Copernican view. There are 2 early editions of Buchanan's works, Thomas Ruddiman's and Peter Berman's. Late works. The first of his important late works was the treatise De Jure Regni apud Scotos, published in 1579. In this famous work, composed in the form of a dialogue, and evidently intended to instill sound political principles into the mind of his pupil, Buchanan lays down the doctrine that the source of all political power is the people, that the king is bound by those conditions under which the supreme power was first committed to his hands, and that it is lawful to resist, even to punish, tyrants. The importance of the work is proved by the persistent efforts of the legislature to suppress it during the century following its publication. It was condemned by Act of Parliament in 1584, and again in 1664, and in 1683 it was burned by the University of Oxford. The second of his larger works is the History of Scotland, Rerum Scoticarum Historia, completed shortly before his death, and published in 1582. It is remarkable for the power and richness of its style, and of great value for the period personally known to the author, which occupies the greater portion of the book. The earlier part is based, to a considerable extent, on the legendary history of Boyce. Buchanan's purpose was to purge the national history of some English lys and Scottish vanit. He said that it would content few and displease many. In fact, its matter gave so much offence that a proclamation was issued calling in all copies of it, as well as of the De Jure Regni, that they might be purged of the offensive and extraordinary matters which they contained. Lasting legacy. Buchanan holds his great and unique place in literature not so much for his own writings as for his strong and lasting influence on subsequent writers. His influence was notable by 1726 when Andrew Miller, a prominent 18th-century bookseller, took over James McEwen's bookshop in London at the sign of Buchanan's Head, Temple Bar. The sign for the shop depicted the face of George Buchanan, a testament to Buchanan's early place and reputation in Scottish letters. Modern publications and influence. Polygon Books have published the poet Robert Crawford's selection of Buchanan's verse in Apollos of the North, selected poems of George Buchanan and Arthur Johnston in 2006, the 500th anniversary of Buchanan's birth. In the lead-up to the anniversary, Professor Roger Mason of the University of St Andrews has published a dialogue on the law of kingship among the Scots, a critical edition and translation of George Buchanan's De Iure Regni apud Scotos Dialogus. Memorials. A statue of Buchanan stands on the west-facing side of the Scott Monument on Princes Street, Edinburgh. It was sculpted by John Rind. A memorial stained glass window stands in the south wall of Greyfriars Kirk.